everyone, and welcome to this new episode of The Citizen. Today, I am joined by a former professor of mine and a historian here at NAU. Shane, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Shane Scarmach. I'm a visiting lecturer in the Department of History here at NAU.
And kind of the idea of having you on today is everyone says, this election is historic. And we're just wondering how much truth is there to that statement?
Well, yeah, that type of language, this is the most important election of our lifetime, this is the most important election ever,
Yeah.
is pretty old. People have been using that for decades, and there's even some research that suggests similar language has been used since like the turn of the 19th century. So that certainly undercuts the force of the claim a little bit, I would say. So how historic is this election? It's always hard to tell. Usually we can't really know how significant an election is going to be until well after the fact. But, I think it's a useful kind of rhetorical tactic for politicians, their campaign staff, people that are supporting particular, people for president or other offices. It's just a way to kind of mobilize voters.
So it sounds like what you're saying is it's a tactic more than rooted in fact.
Yeah, I would say so. I think, Americans tend not to be super interested in elections. The percentage of the voting eligible population that participates in presidential elections, for example, hovers around like somewhere between 50 and 60%. It's much lower for off-year elections. So I think anything people can use to motivate people to pay attention to the election or hopefully get out to the polls and vote for this or that candidate, people will do. But yeah, I don't know that there's much substance to the claim.
So people are using this tactic, and maybe it's successful in bringing more people out to the polls, which could be a good thing. But on the other side, it's kind of, taking away from the elections of the past. Is there like a negative effect to this rhetoric?
Well, yeah, I think one possible negative effect is that it has a kind of depressing, effect on the turnout. Every election can't be the most important election of our lifetime, so, you hear the same thing over and over again. Probably the tendency, I would think, is to kind of tune it out. So it could sort of backfire in that way, I would think. Although, ultimately, as I was saying, it's not clear that it has much effect at all. But yeah, I think framing any particular election as, kind of a pivotal moment or something like that is, can just kind of give people the impression that you're kind of trying to drum up some urgency or necessity, even if it might not be there. So I think, that can have a kind of negative effect,
Right.
I would think.
And the person who comes to my door is telling me that this is the most historic election ever.
Sure.
But you are a historian. Would you ever make a claim like that about an election?
Well, yeah, there are many elections that historians kind of point to as significant, again, mostly after the fact, of course. And, a case could be made for any particular election. If we just take the 20th century, for example, we could point to, for example, the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932, a few years into the Depression. This basically, inaugurated a whole new era in U.S. politics. Similarly, we could point to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, which a kind of older scholarship pointed to as sort of the closing of that era. And we could mention lots of others, the 1860 election, which led to the U.S. Civil War, the 2000 election, which, had various controversies around it, ultimately decided by the Supreme Court. So there's lots of elections that we could point to that are, historic, at least in retrospect. And I think, particularly for political history, it's kind of unavoidable when you're constructing a historical narrative. You're always looking for turning points or a kind of signpost to organize your narrative around. But there is a problem, I think, with focusing too much on elections. it tends to kind of cash out in sort of narrow partisan stories, and it can kind of obscure or mask more long-running historical processes, or just kind of avoid some of the more complicated causes and consequences of historical events.
Right. And so how does that affect the public's knowledge of what's going on?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it tends to emphasize a sort of partisan kind of pendulum swing back and forth. There's a lot of focus on candidates, their personality. Part of that is an effect of the campaigns themselves, right? But yeah, I think it can kind of obscure things that tend to be more substantive in terms of what is shaping U.S. political culture and how is that affecting people's everyday lives. Um, for example, there's a historian named Matthew Lasseter who has a great short essay. It's called Political History Beyond the Blue-Red Divide. And he encourages historians to kind of move beyond partisan contests and look at things like public policy and political economy. And those are, not as flashy and interesting, maybe, but I think, that's good advice for ordinary people as well, because often those are the things that have the most impact on people's lives. And, the sort of campaigns might be interesting in the moment, but they tend to be kind of ephemeral.
Right. And to reel it back into the elections for a second, regardless of like what the impact could be, or how people react to what's going on around them, is there stuff in this election that, like, the last election there was a pandemic, in this election there's been 2 assassination attempts? Mm-hmm. Does it make it telling that this could be historical years down the line?
Yeah, I mean, maybe. Who knows, right? I mean, it's always difficult to say in the moment. Certainly there are, significant things about this election that we can already sort of pick out. This is the first election since the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. That is expected to have a kind of significant impact on the election. The United States is kind of lockstep supporting a genocide in Gaza and a wider war in the Middle East. That had some impact on the Democratic primaries, at least. It's reasonable to expect that will have some impact on the election. The last election was conducted during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. That's obviously a different situation this election. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of things that we can point to that are distinct and might, turn out to be significant even, prospectively.
But we can't predict what's going to be historic.
No. Fortunately, history doesn't work like that.
Even if we want to.
Yeah, I mean, we could try. There's lots of facile predictions that you can find in the media, but they tend not to be super useful.
And what do you think we can expect after this election?
Well, I think that based on reporting that there will be some attempt to contest the election, assuming that Trump loses. I would imagine that will not be the case if he wins, of course. Part of this, I think, is an artifact of the U.S. constitutional system. Elections, at least more recent elections, particularly presidential elections, have just been won by very narrow margins, and they often diverge, or at least the electoral college tally diverges quite a bit from the popular vote. So there is, just a kind of higher level of contestation, we might say, of major elections like the presidency. So I think part of it is just that. Certainly, Trump has kind of invested in a sort of narrative about the election was stolen from him, et cetera, and there's been lots of activity, however ineffectual, around that. It seems like it may continue, again, assuming that he doesn't win. If he does win, I imagine he'll probably be satisfied with that. But as I was just saying, the 2000 election was very contested. Again, it was ultimately decided by the Supreme Court. You guys are probably too young to remember that, but there's lots of controversy about ballots in Florida, hanging chads.
Yeah.
So it's certainly not unprecedented, I think. And there have been other kind of contested elections in the past, the election of 1800, election of 1876. So yeah, not a totally new phenomenon, but maybe a departure from more recent elections.
I don't think there's going to be a lot of people recalling the election from 1800 in midst of this election.
Yeah, probably not. Maybe with good reason, but yeah. It's out there.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today, and that's all for this episode of The Citizen. Thank you for watching.